So this paper I'm presenting today, as Tim mentioned, comes out of the project Beyond Left Behind Places, funded by the 3 research councils, and one element of the project which is concerned with policy approaches and frameworks, and spatial policy approaches and frameworks as well. So what I tried to do in this paper with colleagues is to assess the kind of content and direction of mainstream spatial policies, regional and urban policies basically, since the global financial crisis of 2008, in the light of some theoretical frameworks that were used to frame and kind of understand an earlier shift in spatial policy. It went on in the 70s, 80s, and probably into the 1990s, away from traditional redistributive regional policies that sought to support underdeveloped regions and transfer resources and opportunities from core to peripheral regions, towards growth-based competitiveness policies that sought to equip kind of all regions, and particularly the larger and more dynamic metropolitan regions, to compete more effectively in the global economy. That shift then went on in the 80s and 90s. And some of the frameworks, like Philip McMichael and Neil Brenner, written in the 80s and 90s, or certainly framed in the 80s and 90s, that earlier shift, trying to use some of that terminology to assess what's going on now. Largely European focus, probably West European focus, North American, so very much global North, and Europe, North America. And really trying to assess in quite broad overarching terms the degree and nature of change orientation in spatial policies we've seen since the global financial crisis of 2008. Very much work in progress, with colleagues ongoing. We have a working paper on the project website, which you can find there. We've also submitted a version of the paper to the Journal European Urban and Regional Studies, and we're waiting to hear back about that. So a structured outline of the talk this afternoon: introduction, then we'll just briefly highlight these frameworks that were used, theoretical frameworks that were used to assess this earlier 1970s, 1980s shift in spatial policy. We'll look at the post-2008 setting, context for spatial policy, the key influences, and then we'll focus more on the kind of actual content of spatial policies, how they've evolved since 2008, before concluding. Persistent and growing concern, perhaps, about persistent and increasing social and spatial inequalities between cities and regions in recent years have really raised concerns about the ability of the probably dominant pre-2008 kind of globalization-oriented model of development, based very much on increasing the growth and competitiveness of cities and regions to function and prosper in the global economy. Persistent geographical inequalities have raised growing concerns about the ability of that model to generate spatially balanced and inclusive economic growth. Particularly a lot of concern and discourse around this pattern polarization between what have been called dynamic superstar city regions, where the knowledge economy is based and concentrated, and so-called left-behind places, often post-industrial, some rural regions that seem to have been kind of left behind by globalization, technological change, and so forth. And that's very much a kind of powerful discourse with some material basis, although, of course, reality is often more complicated. We've seen a growing growth of kind of flourishing of research on geography of discontent, so-called, in recent years, in the context of the growth of kind of political populism, the so-called revenge of the places that don't matter, or the left-behind places, to quote Andres Rodriguez Posey, that have expressed this discontent through the ballot box, through voting, in voting for populist movements and parties, and left-behind places have been portrayed as kind of hotbeds of populist support. So some of that emerging research, burgeoning research on the geography of discontent kind of makes a kind of undeveloped connection to spatial policy, particularly in terms of how previous spatial policies and growth-oriented policies may have fueled discontent and contributed to inequalities, and also in terms of the need for new kinds of spatial policies to address inequality and discontent. But this relationship hasn't really been examined in detail. It's received limited attention, so we try to look more fully, I guess, at spatial policy in this paper. We identify three key influences on spatial policy: neoliberalism, as we call it, maybe a widely used academic term, referring to what we would understand as a project of state-based market reform and market rule, which has been introduced in many countries since the 1980s, unevenly associated with privatization, deregulation, liberalization of markets and industries, opening them up to competition. Secondly, the idea, which is very much a feature of the post-2008 period, maybe going back a little earlier than that to the mid-2000s, this idea of a kind of return of the state or a new state capitalism emerging. Return of the state is maybe framed in more kind of popular press sources, media sources, Economist, Financial Times, English language sources. The idea that after a period of state contracting through partly market-oriented reform, that the states have been expanding, growing again since the 2000s, the expanded role of states in managing capitalism in recent years, and we'll say more about this later. And thirdly, I already touched on populism and the geography of discontent as a distinct, perhaps post-financial crisis phenomenon, although obviously populism does go back a long way before then, but something that's grown and received increasing attention in recent years in the literature. So really try to undertake what, as far as we are aware, seems to be the first assessment of how the interactions between these three factors that we highlight has shaped spatial policy in Europe and North America since 2008. Selective in approach, we focus on three main forms of spatial policy: metropolitanisation strategies designed to support the growth of large city regions. Secondly, the extension of competitiveness policies beyond large city regions to smaller cities and towns. And thirdly, the introduction of new place-based industrial policies. And the paper argues that while these new policies and changing forms of policy do focus attention on left-behind places, and in some guises they reject elements of globalism and neoliberalism, the pre-2008 model, they've still not dislodged the underlying emphasis on growth and competitiveness. These post-2008 policies are very much kind of still emerging, quite partial and often contradictory and underdeveloped. So turning to shifting frameworks of spatial policy, just want to highlight two kind of theoretical frameworks that were used to understand this earlier shift. So the idea of a shift from developmentalism to globalism, really in terms of global development, originating from the work of Philip McMichael, 2012 Globalization and Social Change book, translated more into local and regional development by colleagues Andy Pike and Andres Rodriguez-Posey and John Tomini in their local and regional development textbook and in other papers. So developmentalism very much associated with post-war 50s, 60s and 70s, the era of Fordist Keynesianism, industrial mode of development, strong public sector, universal welfare state, redistributive traditional spatial policy. And then the era of globalism, beginning in the 1970s into the 80s and 90s, shift towards neoliberalism, kind of market-based reforms, self-regulating markets, private initiative, participation in the world market, the doctrine of comparative advantage, that guiding economic development policy, export-oriented industrialization, the kind of Washington consensus model based around structural adjustment, and in local and regional development about the growing importance of the supranational level, supranational organizations like the EU and other trade blocs, but also a devolving of kind of policy and responsibility to the local and regional scale, very much a focus on economic competitiveness, on equipping cities and regions to compete more effectively in the global economy. So that's one quite influential framework. And Neil Brenner, the kind of US-based urban theorist, political scientist, originally provides a kind of complementary framework for understanding overarching shifts in spatial policy and planning that took place similarly in the 80s, from the late 70s through the 80s to the early 90s. So Brenner's quite an influential theoretical framework, very abstract and kind of periodization of economic development policy based in the Western European context. I think Germany and the Netherlands particularly that he focused on in his research, and based on kind of translating into spatial geographic terms the work of Bob Jessup, the British state theorist. And Brenner applied his theory to this shift from kind of spatial Keynesianism, traditional redistributive regional policy, forest forms of production in the 60s and 70s, to what he terms urban locational policies in the 1980s and 1990s that sought to basically support strongest metropolitan regions to compete and grow and be centres of prosperity in the global economy. Brenner distinguishes in geographical terms between a scalar dimension, so the different levels of kind of political and economic organisation, from the local to the regional to the national to the supranational, and a territorial dimension in terms of what territories or places were favoured by these strategies. So under the Forrest Keynesian era, the 60s and 70s, the national scale was seen as a central national economy essential unit, so it was very much a primacy of the national over the local and regional. And territorially, it was about redistributive policies, trying to redistribute income, jobs, and opportunities from core to peripheral regions, trying to equalize the distribution of industry and infrastructure investment. And in most countries, post-war Keynesian interventionism, this kind of so-called spatial Keynesianism, was a key factor between the steady process of regional convergence in incomes that characterized most advanced capitalist economies from the 40s through the 1970s. So a narrowing of differences in incomes between regions. And then to kind of shift to neoliberal policies in the 70s and 80s. So in scalar terms, there's an increasing emphasis on the local and the regional, localization of assets and efforts to enhance territorial competitiveness within strategic urbanized spaces, so key city regions within countries that were seen as best placed to compete in the global economy. Cities and city regions become viewed as key engines of economic development. In territorial terms, whereas Keynesian was about redistribution and equalization, this is much more about differentiation, state institutions seeking to channel major assets and investments into the most globally competitive urban and regional spaces. This is Brenner's urban locational policy. And it's generating increasing divergence of incomes and socioeconomic standards between regions. We saw this kind of narrowing of differences in many countries and internationally from the 40s through to the mid-late 70s. We've seen a widening of inequalities since the 1980s in general terms, this increasing divergence. So Brenner provides, I think, a valuable and interesting, productive theoretical vocabulary, but obviously a lot of this analysis is kind of retrospective, looking back on this shift that was well established by the time he conducted his research in the late 1990s. The post-2008 period is obviously ongoing, kind of turbulent, much less clear-cut in terms of where things are going. So it's much harder to characterize in such kind of sweeping and definitive terms, but we'll kind of have a bit of a go at least. But we think there's kind of valuable exercise to try and use some of this language and some of the terminology from these frameworks to frame an analysis of post-2008 changes in spatial policy. So moving to the post-2008 setting for spatial policy, I have already highlighted the three key influences on spatial policy that we identified. So neoliberalism or neoliberalization, which is a bit of a mouthful, but the idea that this is an ongoing and uneven process of state or government facilitated market reform. Very uneven, takes different forms against countries. There's periods where it's advancing quite rapidly and periods where it perhaps stalls or contracts since the 1980s. So it's kind of informed by the theoretical work of writers like Peck and Theodore in geography. So in spatial policy terms, neoliberalization has been associated with urban locational policies. In Brenner, that channel state support to the most, what was seen as the most globally competitive city regions in the 1980s and 90s, often capital regions, but major city regions. Since 2010, and post the global financial crisis, we kind of saw what we can see as a new round of neoliberalization in many countries and internationally, associated very much with austerity policies in response to the global financial crisis and rising government deficits in many countries. This was kind of framed neoliberally as a problem of almost excessive state intervention. So state activity and expenditure needed to be reduced. And as time's gone on, there's more and more research showing how these austerity policies have tended to reinforce and increase existing social and spatial inequalities. Secondly, the new state capitalism, which has been attracting a lot of interest in recent years. I'm referring to the growth of state capitalism and various forms of state intervention since the 2000s, probably goes back a little bit before 2008, but especially since 2008. Based on what Alamy and Dixon call a multiplication of state capital hybrids, including state-owned enterprises and sovereign wealth funds, interventionist forms of statism, for example, bailouts of banks and other major companies and corporations that are seen as strategically important, economic nationalism and protectionism, which we've seen grow, new forms of industrial policy, which have emerged in many countries, and the consolidation of state-led development models, so the prominence of China and other examples of state-led development models. So that's a second key influence. And thirdly, populism and the geography of discontent, which obviously has much earlier roots, but has emerged and been identified as the growth of populism and this discontent as a distinct post-crisis phenomenon in Europe and North America. So political populism defined by the assertion of political differences between the authentic people on the one hand and kind of corrupt and self-serving elites on the other, also undeserving others such as immigrants and minorities. A distinction between the people and these elites or undeserving others. It generates a strong anti-establishment orientation against elites of populism. Beyond this, populism kind of been described as a kind of fairly empty ideology, lacking in content, so it's often elided and conflated with other political strands. You can get different forms of populism, right-wing and left-wing populism. The right-wing populist parties that have been prominent in many European countries, North America, in the form of Trump and taking over the Republican Party, they often combine anti-immigration policies with elements of economic nationalism and economic conservatism, stressing small firms, family, and so forth. They tend to favour then they do generally favour national interventionism and protectionism over global integration, and reflect often quite a strong backlash against globalism and the perceived unfairness of global trade deals and competitors global competition in undermining living standards. Geography of discontent, based on what seems to be a new pattern of territorial political polarization. Older, often less skilled and educated voters tend to have more conservative values, are often associated with left-behind towns and rural areas, while younger, more skilled and educated workers with liberal values tend to be more concentrated in major cities and cosmopolitan centres of the knowledge economy. Obviously, that's a bit broad-brushed and stereotyped, perhaps, and the patterns are often more nuanced and complicated than that in practice, but it's quite a powerful set of ideas. And left-behind places are seen as hotspots of discontent, based on some evidence for voting patterns in the former industrial areas, rural areas with a history of voting Labour in the Northern Midlands of England, voting for Brexit. The US so-called Rust Belt and former industrial areas in the Midwest and Northeast emerging as supporters of Trump. The discourse around peripheral France associated with the work of Julie and others. So these are the kind of three key strands, three key influences on spatial policy that we identify. So turning to the evolution of spatial policy itself since 2008, and we focus quite selectively on three forms of spatial policy. So reinforced and continued metropolitanisation. So this is basically Brenner's urban locational policies that emerged in the 80s, being reinforced and deepened. And the influential idea of city regions as the key engines of economic growth. And this gained real additional new momentum from the mid-2000s, late 2000s, becoming a dominant narrative internationally. The World Bank Reshaping Economic Geography report in 2009 argued that spatially unbalanced economic growth should be accepted by policymakers because it reflected the underlying benefits of urban agglomeration in increasing growth, innovation, productivity, and that over time, classic neoclassical economic thinking, in many ways, these spatial inequalities would tend to reduce and be ironed out through the very process of kind of market integration and liberating the factors of production. And drawing on the kind of established global city narrative. So driven by this dominant international narrative among international organizations, think tanks, OECD, World Bank, European Commission, national governments, influenced at least by this narrative, the concept of metropolitanisation gained further ground that policy needed to support the leading city regions within a country. As my colleague Andy Pike has argued, this metropolitanisation is a kind of city-centric logic. It's the assumption that growth will kind of spread out from central cities to benefit smaller towns and their surrounding rural hinterlands over time, over the long term. Perhaps in recent years that assumption has been increasingly questioned. So really reinforcing urban locational policy from the 80s and 90s based on measures to enhance the global competitiveness of metropolitan regions should be prioritized for infrastructure investment and innovation support. And in the immediate post-crisis period, we really saw this kind of from 2009 through probably to about 2014. This was really evident, this reinforced continued metropolitanisation, and it's still there, still in place, although it's been increasingly challenged perhaps in recent years. Secondly, we've seen the extension of competitiveness policies to smaller cities and towns. So particularly since about 2016, we've seen new and revived discourses of local and regional development emerge to address spatial inequalities and the geography of discontent, influenced strongly by the rise of political populism. So in the US, Donald Trump promised to reverse globalization, revive traditional industries, and bring jobs back to Rust Belt states. Maybe it didn't quite come to fruition, but things like renegotiating NAFTA were certainly undertaken, obviously slapping tariffs on goods from China and other countries. More recently, his successor, Joe Biden, seeking to use increased federal expenditure and large bits of government expenditure and legislation to revive these same heartland regions. In the UK, Boris Johnson's Conservatives appealed very successfully in the short term to traditionally Labour voting areas in the Northern Midlands of England through this discourse of levelling up, of promising to level up growth across the country, whatever that really meant in practice. Meanwhile, the French government has sought to respond to the discontent of so-called peripheral France through a renewed emphasis on territorial cohesion and the creation of a new agency and a suite of new policies, really, in that guise. So what this seems to be really leading to is the extension of conventional growth-oriented competitiveness policies beyond large metropolitan regions, and towns and smaller and medium-sized cities have become a new focus of state policy. So, for example, towns policies in France and the UK introduced in recent years Action Coeur de Ville and the Towns Fund in the UK. These policies aim to address decline largely through fairly similar competitiveness strategies to those developed for larger cities, emphasizing attractiveness, regeneration, infrastructure alongside quality of life and heritage and place issues. You can see some illustrations. This is the Action Coeur de Ville, the 235 towns that have been selected and funded through this, mainly, I understand, through negotiations between local government and departments and national government. In the UK, the 101 towns were invited by the government to apply for towns funding. There's some ranking into 3 levels and quite a lot of political controversy over some of the towns that were selected, particularly the ones that went in this high priority category. But you can see quite a lot of them in the Northern Midlands of England. And the third key set of policies, new place-based industrial and infrastructure policies. So renewed interest in industrial policy, again, goes back certainly to the immediate aftermath of the global financial crisis and back to the early 2000s in some countries as well. But we've seen a real upsurge in recent years, particularly since 2020 and very much led by the US. Increased focus on large-scale industrial policy in the context of increased geopolitical tensions, accelerating climate change, and the disruptive effects of the COVID pandemic. This is most evident in relation to green growth and clean energy technology led by the US under Joe Biden. You can see him signing the signature Inflation Reduction Act from 2022. Nothing to do with reducing inflation. That was just the way it had to be framed to get the legislation passed politically. But really about large-scale green growth and state investment. Been accompanied by 3 other major pieces of legislation: the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act from 2021, the American Rescue Plan, and the Chips and Science Act, which sought to facilitate building of semiconductor and high-tech factories in the US. Together account for 3.8 trillion of spending, really representing a massive expansion of state investment in industrial policy. And this approach has been described by the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen as modern supply-side economics, which aims to expand national productive capacity. So it's really about strengthening the national industrial base rather than supporting global trade. Strengthening national and local resilience to global economic shocks, and thirdly, promoting greater fairness for domestic workers and businesses. The IRA and Inflation Reduction Act incorporates a strong element of spatial targeting to tackle social and spatial inequality by focusing investment in underdeveloped or left behind areas. These energy communities, as is defined in the IRA, brownfield sites, places that are coal plants or coal mines and that have above average fossil fuel employment and higher than average unemployment. They qualify for an extra 10% of tax incentives under the IRA. The EU has kind of maybe been a bit wrong-footed by this large-scale expansion of industrial policy, protectionism as it's often seen in the US, and responded by establishing its own green industrial plan based on 4 pillars: a simplified regulatory environment, faster access to funding, enhanced skills, and open trade. Interestingly, the EU distinguishing it from the more protectionist stance of the US by retaining a more liberal, globalist, pro-market approach. And we tried to characterize these 3 forms of spatial policy, bring it back to these earlier theoretical frameworks. You can see the underlying rationale, shaping influences on metropolitanisation, neoliberalism, the so-called new economic geography, World Bank report, very influential, still strongly globalist. It's still about localization and differentiation, supporting, developing customized policies really to support large cities to compete in the global economy. Involves continued decentralization, customization, often asymmetric, and particular focus on creating metropolitan governance arrangements and structures in recent years. The extension of competitiveness policies to smaller cities and towns, driven by an electoral imperative to address the geography of discontent, influenced by populism, still neoliberalism, a much weaker globalism extended to cities and smaller towns, but it doesn't break with globalism. It's still the idea they should try to compete nationally and internationally. Involves localization, more kind of localized support for these towns and smaller cities. Kind of weak equalization in that these policies are, at least rhetorically, framed in terms of addressing inequalities, but they don't really put the funding or frameworks in place to really do that. Involve, I think, some increased centralization, increasing new larger role for national government in funding and designing these policies, but often alongside kind of decentralized delivery through and planning through local government. The new industrial and infrastructure policies led by the US, very much about building domestic industrial capacity. It's an economics of national security really driving it. Resilience and fairness, as we saw. Shaped by populism and, again, responding to the geography of discontent, but much more the kind of a manifestation of the new state capitalism that's been emerging. Particularly in its US variant, go much stronger in rejecting elements of globalism, the existing kind of neoliberal global model, particularly its commitment to kind of free trade and international integration. Danny Roderick's term, the Harvard-based economist, has used the term productivism to describe this new approach about building domestic productive industrial capacity and expanding opportunities to include all workers and communities, in particularly disadvantaged areas. We can see, I think, a renewed nationalization and centralization and role of national governments, signature pieces of national legislation in the US, particularly on funding, but again, combined with localization of delivery. And stronger equalization, stronger efforts to redistribute opportunities and to support underdeveloped or left behind areas through mechanisms such as tax subsidies. So to conclude, finally, conscious of time, probably gone on a little bit too long. So we see this really, that's the kind of evolution of spatial policy in recent years as reflecting and situated within a kind of delayed post-2008 crisis of neoliberalism and the globalization-oriented model, which actually got reinforced immediately post-crisis from 2009, perhaps through to about 2014, and elements of it persist alongside the growth of variegated state capitalism and populism discontent. But growing concerns with spatial inequalities, which have become more prominent since 2015, 2016. The inequalities often are of much longer standing, but may have been accentuated and reinforced since 2008. Concerns with spatial inequalities and discontent are really challenging the long-standing emphasis on metropolitan growth. So new political economic discourse and policies emerged from 2006, really strongly: populism, economic nationalism, protectionism, that are about promoting the interests of domestic firms, workers and communities over those of international investors and institutions and established and pre-existing economic and political elites. This has started to foster new state strategies for left behind places, language of levelling up in the UK, for example, territorial cohesion in France. We've seen the introduction of kind of competitiveness strategies for towns and smaller cities, and stronger place-based industrial policies, particularly in the US, that are prioritizing left behind places. This US-led productivism, which represents, I think, the strongest break with neoliberalism that we've seen so far, and perhaps a kind of real framing of a kind of social democratic, almost a renewed social democratic interventionist economic policies that is potentially redistributionist. But will this be sufficient or enough to kind of offset the ongoing process of agglomeration, perhaps particularly within the knowledge economy, in kind of dynamic superstar cities and metropolitan regions? So I shall stop there. Thanks very much for listening, and very happy to take questions.